Okay. All right. I hope everybody had a good lunch. Hope you feel nourished and rested up a little bit. Our next speaker for today is Katherine Stewart. And I encountered Katherine's work initially through the documentary film co-directed by Rob Reiner and Dan Partland entitled God and Country. And that, to me, is the best place to start about conversations with Christian nationalism. And that book, I later discovered, was actually based on Katherine's initial book, or second book, not the Good News Club, Power Worshippers, yes. So then I read The Power Worshippers, which goes far more in detail, which was incredible. And Katherine has a brand new book out, Money, Lies, and God. And it's an incredible book. Katherine has worked as an investigative journalist specifically on this topic of Christian nationalism for the last 16 years. And this is deeply personal to her and her family. And she has, in my estimation, the best overall grasp of all the different moving parts of Christian nationalism, which is incredibly important because Christian nationalism is both very subtle and very obvious at the same time. And it's very hard for us to sometimes pinpoint where things go wrong. So Katherine will speak for probably about 40 minutes or so. She and I will have a conversation, and then we will do some Q&A. So let's welcome Katherine Stewart.
Thank you, guys. I'm just really grateful to be here. Thank you so much, Corey. We first met nearly a year ago, and we've been talking about this, and I'm just so glad we got to make it happen. Was grateful to every single one of you for attending this gathering. It's time for these sort of difficult but important conversations, and I'm really inspired by the previous speakers and their testimonies and the knowledge that they had to impart. I want to start by, I've been reporting at the intersection of religion and politics for over 16 years. Money, Lies, and God is my third book on this topic. But I want to start off by telling you a little bit of my story, because my journey into this field came as a bit of a surprise to me. It began when I was in late 2008, early 2009. We were living, my family and I, in Santa Barbara, California. Our daughter was in her very first years of elementary school. Pardon me. I'm so sorry. It's hay fever. I'm not sick. And it started with an event that at first seemed too small to notice until all of a sudden it was too big to ignore. I learned that something called a Good News Club was coming to our public elementary schools. Now, Good News Clubs are after-school programs that inculcate very young children into a hardline variety of evangelical Christianity. And they encourage kids to recruit their peers to the club. They instruct them to recruit their peers to the club. And they tell these kids, they convey the message very clearly that if they don't believe in Jesus, they're going to go to hell, and they need to attend the right kind of church, not just any old church, the right kind. So I saw how the adults that were leading these clubs were using their position inside the public schools in order to get kids to target their classmates, particularly members of religious minority groups, for what I could only describe as faith-based bullying and bigotry. They were also confusing kids into thinking their public school endorses a particular form of religion. Because we're talking about little kids here. I mean, K through 5, right? A centerpiece of the program is called the Wordless Book. It's used to convert children who are too young to read. For little kids especially, public schools have a kind of cloak of authority. They think that if it's taught in school, it must be what the school and the state wants them to believe. A little girl that our family knew who was attending the club was targeted by one of her classmates who she'd previously just been friends with but who had started attending the club, and said to her, well, you don't believe in Jesus, so you're going to go to hell. And our friend's daughter said, that's not true, and they got into a fight about this. And the teacher overheard the exchange, and she said, you know, different religions believe in different things, and our friend's daughter was fine with that. But the other little girl who was attending a Good News Club, she started to cry, and she said, I know it must be true because they teach it in school, and they don't teach things in school that aren't true. And I was also struck that a mom in our community said to me, well, my daughter, I sent her to the Good News Club because I thought I want her to have some religious education. After school, it's an extra hour of free childcare. It really helps me, hour and a half. And she came home and she said, Mom, we're going to go to hell because we're Catholics and we attend a Catholic church. You know, our school happened to be down the road from Westmont College. It's a very well-regarded and beautiful evangelical college. And the parent body at our school is perhaps a third to half of evangelical. Now, here's the thing that really set off alarm bells to me. Most of my mom friends at our public school were Westmont moms. They were professors or wives of professors. But as far as I could tell, they did not want a Good News Club in our public school. So a group of the moms met the Good News Club leaders and said, we too are evangelical, we believe in the Great Commission, but you're not right for our school. We'd like to offer you free and better space in the evangelical church that's right next door to the school. You could just walk right on over, free space, same time, right after school. The Good News Club leaders declined. They insisted on being in the public school. So that really struck me. I thought, why don't they want to be in the public schools? And what are they telling these kids? What do the Good News Club leaders really believe? And how is it possible for them to operate legally in public elementary schools, given the separation of church and state? That constitutional principle enshrined of the very first clause of our very first amendment. So that's where my journey began. I began to dig into the organizations that surrounded the Good News Club and the main organization behind it, which is called the Child Evangelism Fellowship. I learned about the well-funded legal advocacy organizations and legal strategists that were working on behalf of the Good News Club and other initiatives like it. I learned about the policy groups and think tanks with which they were connected and the pastoral networks that they drew from. I'm an investigative journalist. I've always thought you don't really know what's happening unless you're in the room. So my first foray was I went to the national convention of the Child Evangelism Fellowship, the national organization sponsoring Good News Clubs. There were, at the time, 2,700 of these Good News Clubs in public elementary schools nationwide. And nobody had really addressed this massive change in what I could see was a kind of after-school environment on public school grounds. So I thought, if they have a right to come to our school, I have a right to go to their national convention. So I signed up using my own name, and I went. What I saw really shocked me. I heard UCC churches, congregational churches, described as New Age churches. I heard a woman who was giving a seminar on reaching out to children from Hispanic and Latino families, describe Catholicism as a false religion. She told a story, this just broke my heart. She told a story of a little boy who was in her Good News Club, and he said, he was from a Catholic family, and he said, my big brother's in heaven. And she said, I had to tell that little boy that his big brother is not in heaven. And I just thought, and she's doing this in a public school. How is this legal and possible? Leaders of the Good News Club and their legal allies described public schools as their mission fields and other people's children as the harvest. They seem to view public schools with contempt. At that national convention, I heard speakers talk about breaking down the doors of the public schools, forcing open the doors. Some spoke about kicking in the doors. They described public schools as scenes of spiritual battle. You know, this is a movement that claims to stand for small-town values and the dignity of American families, but they were treating our small town and families that didn't look like theirs with contempt. I came to realize that their actions were part of a much larger effort to undermine public education. They wanted to force their programming into the public schools, and at the same time, they were connected to groups that were trying to siphon money out of the public school system and divert it to religious schools that were free to teach contempt for other people of other faiths, free to teach creationism and any other doctrine they want to, which religious schools are allowed to do all these things, but that's precisely the reason for the separation of church and state. Religions are not subject to the same anti-discrimination laws, the same, I would say, tax laws that other non-religious nonprofits aren't. But here, this is a group that wanted to divert public money, taxpayer money, yours and mine, to religious schools in a way that had been sort of prohibited previously through the interpretation of the First Amendment. I came to realize that this movement was not remotely conservative. A true conservative movement would want to preserve institutions and principles that have served us over time. This was a movement with a radical vision to remake America, frankly, along authoritarian lines. So that's really the start of my own journey into this world. Now, at the time Obama was president, the big story in religion news was the rise of the so-called nuns, that is, people who don't identify with any particular religious tradition. But it was clear to me even then that people outside the movement, and I would say much, if not most of the mainstream media, was underestimating this movement. They were underestimating its funding sources. This is a movement that was collecting huge amounts of money. They were underestimating its organizational capacity. It's a movement that was, it's a leadership-driven movement. It's not like driven by the rank and file. It's leadership-driven, organization-driven, and there was a lot of money going into these organizations that were deeply interconnected. The strength of this movement is in that dense organizational infrastructure. And it was a movement that was incredibly ambitious. In the spaces that they share, which I've spent over 16 years visiting, they will talk about their aims to remake our country along, frankly, theocratic and authoritarian lines. Now, to be sure, many of the rank and file in this movement believed they were engaging in culture war issues. They were motivated to by their movement's purported defense of American families or abortion, things like that. But the leaders of the movement were engaged in a political war for the future of democracy. They were sort of exploiting these culture war issues in order, for a larger purpose. The Christian Nationalist movement long preceded Donald Trump, and it will long outlast him. But make no mistake, it is the movement that brought Donald Trump to power. He would not have won in 2016 without the support of movement leaders. In advance of the 2016 election, as Reverend Scheck spoke of, he was making connections within that community through the Billionaires Club with Pat Robertson, but also through Paula White, who played a very strong role in introducing him to a lot of say, hardline religious and also charismatic Christian leaders, leaders affiliated with a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation and the like. And he also promised, in advance of the 2016 election, he had a meeting with over 1,000 evangelical pastors in New York City, and he promised three things. I'm going to put Mike Pence in as vice president. I'm going to have an evangelical advisory council, and he held up a list of judges, like a list of shiny new bonds, and he said, I'm going to choose judges from this list. It was sort of, Federal Society, Leonard Leo vetted, if you guys know what the Federal Society is. And he said, all these judges are pro-life. And with those three things, the groundwork had already been laid, but he sort of clinched the deal. This is a movement that much of it functions as a giant voter turnout machine, and the movement put the full force of its voter turnout machine behind him at that point. Some of the leaders, by the way, I think in advance of that moment, were really hoping for Ted Cruz, because they thought he's, more trustworthy, he's true representative of our movement. But once he lost the primary, it was really clear that, Trump was their guy and they were going to support him no matter what. Many people continue to wonder, how is it possible that a movement could stand behind someone who represents none of the purported family values that they claim to care about? People still scratch their heads about that. They compare him, this is how they do it, they compare him to a biblical king, like a King Cyrus, right? An imperfect ruler through whom God chose to enact his will. Well, here's the thing about kings. They are not the kings of democracies. They are not democratic figures. They are the law unto themselves. And Donald Trump is the law unto himself. He ignores or violates any law or norm that he doesn't happen to like, any constitutional amendment that gets in his way. And this makes him the perfect representative of a movement that simply doesn't believe in democracy or its institutions or its principles. They talk about tearing down, smashing the administrative state. That's the institutions of a functioning democratic government. You hear that kind of language now coming out of the Trump White House and its representatives like Russell Vought. Donald Trump violates the norms. He breaks all the rules. He shifts the goalposts, and then he shifts them again, and he shifts them again until they're no longer on the playing field. This is how you break democracy itself. I'd like to shift a bit now and talk about authoritarianism. And I want to suggest that sometimes authoritarianism, like Christian nationalism, is misunderstood. Authoritarianism, like Christian nationalism, is not a full-fledged political program that majorities endorse, that spontaneously every single member of the rank and file who lends their support to this dynamic wants in advance. These things, authoritarianism, is often brought about by the coordinated actions of distinct groups that may not be fully aware of the results of their collective actions. So let's say when a voter casts her vote to defend the unborn, right, or to defend the American family, she's not arguing for major changes necessarily in the way our government is run. She's more making a statement about what she values in herself, like her values. But with her actions, she may be lending support to a religious nationalist agenda and an authoritarian agenda. In my journey through this world, I've actually met a lot of really nice people. They love their families, they care about their neighbors, they truly believe they're doing good for America and for the world. Many of them sincerely believe they're working to strengthen our country. That's what they've been told, right? All of their good intentions have been harnessed in service of an agenda that is weakening our nation, not making it stronger. It's weakening our economy. Has anybody paid attention to what the dollar is doing internationally? It's just not doing well at all. It's dividing our communities. It's hollowing out the middle and working classes. It's weakening our position in the world. It's eliminating chances of reasoned discourse among our major two political parties, and it's leading to dangerous levels of polarization, spreading disinformation and propaganda and conspiracism. It makes our society less reasonable and less governable. And that is by design, because when a society becomes unreasonable and ungovernable, it helps clear the way for an authoritarian strongman figure to come in and say, I alone can fix it. The attacks on democracy we're now seeing unfolding in the United States are therefore best not understood as the work of any single ideology, but rather a kind of pathology. In my book, Money, Lies, and God, I show that this attack is hitting us on three fronts: money, the lies, and the God, by which I mean the exploitation of religion for politics and power. So when I use the word God in my title, of course, I am not talking about a single religion or a theology or God. I am referring instead to a certain political use or appropriation of certain kinds of religion and the suppression or denigration of other kinds of religion. In the American context, this includes the denigration of forms of Christianity that emphasize love, empathy, and the social gospel. Instead, it elevates obedience, punishment, an us versus them mentality, and hierarchies supposedly ordained of God. In advance of me coming out here, we were chatting about something I heard at one of the conferences I attended in this past year. There was a head of faith outreach for this organization. It's one of the major organizations that mobilized the vote in advance of the 2024 election. And the head of faith outreach, a fellow named Lucas Miles, authored a book titled Woke Jesus, I think it's the heresy, the heretical, it's like the heresy destroying Christianity. And he identified, in this gathering that I attended, he identified the social gospel as a form of heresy, right? He said, we're going to form a new Council of Nicaea. We've got 3,500 churches participating, and we're going to essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, we're going to lay down what Christianity is and what it isn't. So you guys here in this UCC church, you would be considered representatives of this woke Jesus, I suppose. Religious nationalism is not uniquely remote to America, and it's not uniquely, or to Christianity. I would say I want to share an anecdote that was told to me very recently by a Canadian friend. He's a devout and conservative Christian, but his family is from a Muslim-majority country with a history of persecution. He recently ran for political office in a religiously diverse region of that country. His Christian faith is deeply important to him. But when it started to look like he was actually going to win his election, a member of one of the political opposition parties spread the lie that he is a secret Muslim. His poll numbers promptly cratered, and he lost his election. Now, the worst thing about the experience, he was horrified. First of all, he said, they lied about my faith, and that's terrible. And of course, they used Islamophobia to sort of do this. But that wasn't the worst thing. At the end of the election, he said the worst thing was that nobody was talking about policy. Nobody was talking about how to make life materially better for the constituents, or how to bring the diverse communities of constituents together to problem solve, to fight corruption, or to unite the community. Instead, it was all about identity, what you are, not who you are, not what you can do. It's which tribe are you a member of? Are you one of us, or are you one of them? In America, we've been trained to think of this kind of identity politics as something that happens on the left, and it does happen sometimes on the left, but identity politics, and it's usually, by the way, done in an effort to kind of bring some sense of equality for groups that have been traditionally marginalized or discriminated against. That what are you rather than who are you? But identity politics can also be practiced by majority groups or groups that feel that they are a majority, or want to be a majority, or want to cast themselves as the authentic representatives of the entire and diverse nation. This kind of religious nationalism, in an extreme form, is an authoritarian's best friend. Organizations like Freedom House or World Population Review, they offer maps that score every country on its measures of freedom. Now, there's some variation amongst the scores. There are nuances specific to different regions, et cetera. But broadly speaking, the maps show that countries that are the most religious nationalist are overrepresented as the most unfree. Discrimination against women, against sexual minorities, against religious minorities, and other disfavored groups is endemic. Journalists are censored or persecuted. Political opposition is squelched. Unsurprisingly, these countries are also among the most oligarchic and corrupt. Sometimes religious nationalism is easier to see when we're looking at other countries, when you have leaders like Putin in Russia, or Erdogan in Turkey, or I would say leaders in Iran, and too many others to name. When these leaders bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in order to consolidate authoritarian forms of political power, we rightly recognize that as a form of religious nationalism. They're dividing their own communities into the us versus the them. They're giving their people targets to hate, scapegoats upon whom they can blame all of their troubles. And you can see that these countries are theocratic in a certain fake sense, and that there is an official religion, and they try to impose their religious values on the entire population. But I think they're better described as cronyistic kleptocracies with theocratic features, making use of political religion as one among only several tools, which also include the brutal suppression of their own population, suppression of free speech, and squelching of political opposition. Why do authoritarians love religious nationalism so much? I think part of it has to do with distraction. Again, if you can get people focused on the culture wars and outrage politics, they're just going to be distracted. It's like the laser pointer cat toy on the floor, where the cat jumps at the red thing, like the red light going around the floor, and doesn't see the bigger picture. You get them focused on some of these culture war issues, some of which affect very few people. They won't notice that their leaders are enriching themselves and their friends at the public expense. The other part is fear. More specifically, it's about giving people an enemy so vile and hateful that any and all measures against it are imperative. It's about creating this sense of crisis, this sense of emergency. We are on the precipice. We are about to lose everything we hold dear. It's going to be chaos, and that helps justify the dismantling of the guardrails of democracy, the institutions and the norms. It's about creating scapegoats again, so people won't realize the real sources of their challenges. So I want to talk about the real sources. And I want to start with the first word in the title of my book, money. In the run-up to the 2020 election, I heard Franklin Graham speak on a call. It was called Evangelicals for Trump. And he was explaining his support for our current president. He said, we're nostalgic for the America of the late 1950s and early 1960s. And, we're nostalgic for that time, and Trump is nostalgic for that time too. He's nostalgic for that version of America. And that's why we support him. Now let's just do a thought experiment, okay? Let's set aside the fact that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts were not even passed until the mid-1960s. It's true, that's the America that they're hankering for, but let's just set that to the side, right? Let's just set aside Jim Crow. Let's set aside the rampant discrimination against people of color, against women and other groups. Let's just set all of that aside for the minute and do a thought experiment. What else was happening during that period? In the 1950s, the average American CEO earned 17 times the amount of the average American worker, right? So that CEO could have a pretty nice life. They could live in a nice home, maybe have a second home, maybe have a boat, take vacations, send their kids to private schools, join a country club, etc. They could have a very nice life. Now let's compare to what's happening today. The average CEO of the American Fortune 500 earns about 300 times the amount of the average American worker. Many of these CEOs have fifth and sixth homes, along with underground bunkers where they believe they can retreat to safety if the dystopian economy that they helped to create implodes. Over the past decade, we've seen a massive upward concentration of wealth at the very tippy top of the economic ladder. And it's really destabilized and hollowed out the working and middle classes, making people angry for good reason, but they don't always understand why. So I'm going to go over just a few statistics. The amount of total wealth created for the 19 richest American families in 2024 is $1 trillion. $1 trillion. I don't even know what that looks like. And that's divided amongst just 19 American families. Since 2005, the bottom 90% of America has owned less than the one top percent of Americans. Just think about that. The decline in the average tax rate for the top 0.1% of Americans from 1933 to 2020 is about 50%, whereas the average increase in the average tax rate for that's the top zero, for bottom 90% from 1933 to 2020 is 150%. So on the top 0.1%, you have a 50% decline. They're paying less taxes. And the bottom 90%, it's increased by 150%. We have a population with real and legitimate grievances. You've got two parents, too many places, 2 parents, 4 jobs, and they're still trying to afford a decent lifestyle for their children. Young adults can barely afford to house and feed themselves, let alone their families. Anybody have young adults who are trying to make it in today's economy? It is brutal. I mean, it is nothing like when I graduated from college, when I finished college. The anti-democratic movement is very good at harnessing these grievances, this sense of loss, and they're very good at creating an enemy or a scapegoat to blame. Often the story of rising inequality is framed as a complaint about fairness. They say, it just seems unfair that a few people should get to own multiple mega yachts while the rest of us have to sink or swim. If you want to talk about multiple mega yachts, by the way, just Google Betsy DeVos's yachts with an S. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. Unless she's sold most of them, you'll get an eyeful. But you know, the big issue is not just about fairness, it's about power. The kind of inequality we have now means giving tremendous amounts of power to people who happen to hold oligarchic wealth. Oligarch, this is a word we like to apply previously in a previous era to like Russian oligarchs, and the idea is that there's something nefarious about it. They're stealing from the public purse. They've been given privileged contracts. They're amassing enormous wealth while the rest of Russia lives under a sad economy. Well, we're seeing oligarchs in America today, and we're starting to see them under some of the same conditions. You know, the 15th century general and military theorist Raimondo Montecuccoli said, to wage war, first you need money, second you need money, and third you need money. Over the past decades, billions of dollars have flowed into the infrastructure of this anti-democratic movement. And most of it has come from this sector of uber-wealthy individuals and family foundations, and they've invested in think tanks, policy groups, pastoral initiatives, and networking organizations that link up hard-right economic ideologies that benefit and justify the wealth of their donors with the culture war positions that get the rank and file to vote in their favor. So it's that alliance, between, I would say, priests and kings, right? You got the kings who want to grow their empires and their wealth, and they don't want any trouble from the little people, but how do you get the little people involved? It's through sort of priestly hierarchies that tell them that, this is the right way for things to happen. Now, of course, America has a lot of very wealthy people. I mean, we haven't had an enormous, innovative, and entrepreneurial spirit in our country, and there are many wealthy people who devote their money to positive endeavors, trying to alleviate some of the problems in our economy, trying to alleviate, come up with solutions to the challenges that ail us. But a relatively small but significant sector use their extraordinary power to corrupt the government so it's going to work to preserve their fortunes at the expense of the public. A lot of the decisions that really matter today, like where the federal government should spend its money and who it should hire and fire, what are we going to do about tech and media? These decisions are not in the hands anymore of elected representatives of the people, elected officials. Instead, they're in the hands of unelected oligarchs and unelected billionaires. I'm thinking about Elon Musk and his 22-year-old minions who are somehow allowed to maraud through the government, slashing and burning. And I'm like, what is the legal basis for this? Some of these folks are investing heavily in misinformation so the public won't figure out how badly they're being screwed. And that leads me to the second word in the title of my book, lies. Disinformation is, of course, as old as politics, but we're at a new level. The thing I want to emphasize here is that our achievements in the field of lies have been a long time in building. The pro-authoritarian, anti-democratic movement has promoted a propaganda sphere that has really taken over much of our information space, but it wasn't made from nothing. We have a range of think tanks now that were created over decades, not to think about anything, but simply to promote a string of falsifications and ideologically driven talking points. We've turned our data and our information processing assets over to private actors in the tech sector, whose profit doesn't just come from how well they inform us, but rather from how well they manipulate us. We have a media sector that has fallen, unfortunately, into the hands of individuals and market leaders whose profits come not from informing us either, but rather by providing clickbait, and they rely on the power of government to actually strangle competition, not to promote it. So much of the public policy we're seeing today in our country is about performative cruelty. That is, it's meant to put on a show, to promote this or that authoritarian narrative. It's inflicting real cruelty on a set of people, but it's performative. The performance is really for the rest of us, to frighten us into submission, to make us comply in advance, or for those who like it, to say, look at those bad people. It gives them that sense of vengeance in that same gathering that I described earlier, where the author of that book, Woke Jesus, spoke, Steve Bannon spoke. And this is after the election, after they won the 2024 election. And this was the angriest group of winners I've ever seen. They really won the election, but Bannon gets up there and he said, I want retribution. I want old-style, Old Testament retribution. That's what he's saying. Trump ran on promises of retribution of the enemies that they've been taught to blame for their problems, and they're delivering. So a lot of those dominance displays, the punishing of political enemies, the scapegoating of targets, the acting out of grievances is delivering on the retribution that Trump promised. The parts of the current public policy that aren't merely performative are mostly redistributive. They're intended to distribute wealth from the public to a tiny sector of super wealthy individuals who are favorable to the movement. This is the fairly predictable result when you combine extreme inequality with a political system fueled by dark money, which is what the Supreme Court means when it talks about free speech. Donald Trump may have been the perfect person to take us down the hallway that leads from democracy to autocracy. But make no mistake, many Americans in public and private worked long and hard to build that hallway and to roll out the red carpet. Today, the Trump administration's assault on democracy has entered a new and dangerous phase. We're seeing the conversion of federal law enforcement and the system of justice into an instrument for punishing enemies of the regime and its leader. We've seen consolidating control of both the sectors of the media, systems of justice, deploying U.S. military against so-called domestic enemy, the executive declaring Antifa, whatever that means, a domestic terror organization. I think somebody quoted, I know it's not an organization because I don't get, 10 emails a day asking me for donations to Antifa. I get at least 10 emails a day from representatives of both political parties asking for small dollar donations. An article published on the website of the Cato Institute. Do you guys know Cato? It's libertarian. It's hardly some radical lefty commie representative. They said Antifa is not a formal organization, but rather an idea, the way Taoism or CrossFit or going keto are ideas, right? Trump's declaring Antifa terror is, they declared, quote, idiotic on multiple levels. Idiotic on multiple levels. Cato said that. But the point of the order is to smear anyone remotely not on board with the MAGA agenda as so-called radical left and set the stage for persecution. But, whether the GOP's plan to destroy American democracy for good will succeed can't be known. I should say whether the MAGA movement, because the MAGA movement has unfortunately taken over the GOP. So we don't know if the MAGA movement is going to destroy democracy for good yet. But what those of us who still believe in the promise America should do now is clear. This is not the time to curl up in despair. We have institutions to protect the legitimacy of religious organizations and religious institutions to protect, pro-democracy organizations to support, lawsuits to pursue, corruption to expose, and midterm elections in just over a year's time. I believe that those of us who believe in the best of the American promise, are a majority of the country. We have been, the other side, I would say the MAGA movement turns out the vote in disproportionate numbers. And in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't bother to vote, and an additional number have their votes essentially stolen from them through race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression tactics, which is shameful and disgusting. It doesn't take majorities to win an election, just disproportionately mobilized minorities. But if everybody turned out, if enough of us can turn out, more people, turned out than last time, I believe that we actually have a chance. The same forces that brought us an anti-democratic movement have succeeded in undermining key institutions. So we can start learning by how those institutions have been undermined and commit ourselves to the process of restoring them. Last December, Politico published a terrific piece by a Turkish journalist who lived through and documented Erdogan's methodical process of state capture and pushback, which is ongoing. She actually makes some fantastic suggestions about not just how to survive the coming few years, but also how to emerge stronger. And this piece is well worth a read. She reminds us that it takes time for the autocrat to consolidate control. So it's vital to remain engaged. The way I like to put it now is the concrete is being poured, but it hasn't hardened yet, and it hasn't all been poured. We're still free to have these conversations here in a house of worship. And that's really a big thing. So we have to take action where we can. She advises us to focus on strategic and broad-based actions that have appeal beyond the professional classes. You want to reach all of America, right? She tells us to work with other like-minded organizations, even if you don't agree on everything. This is really important. By embracing a big tent mentality, we can and should collaborate with those who share at least a majority of our goals. To paraphrase a former president, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. We're like a big, fractious family with 12 kids. No one's going to agree on everything. No one's going to get everything they want. You know, that little girl's not going to get her pony, right? But if we can agree on more than we disagree on some fundamental democratic principles, then we can and should work together. We need to build the infrastructure of a pro-democracy movement at all levels. There are things we can do as individuals, like vote, like get members of our inner circles to vote and hold them accountable, and things we do when we join together with others, things we can do better when we join forces. There are lots of pro-democracy organizations, so get involved with one or start your own. Houses of worship have a really important role to play. You know, a lot of this filters down to the local level, so it's very important to get involved in your local community, get involved in your local school board. If you sit it out and think someone else is gonna, you know, get involved, guess who shows up? It's the Moms for Liberty. Do you guys know who they are? I mean, so, do you want them deciding what your kids are gonna learn in school? It's really important to, I mean, local public libraries really are worth defending. We need to build networks of support and kindness and empathy and mutual aid in whatever way that looks like. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there's no shortage of avenues for engagement. And finally, I want to point out that there is nothing more meaningful than being part of the struggle for democracy. It's action that gives you hope. Hope isn't something you just sit around and look for. It's something you actually engage in. And when you get involved in the struggle for democracy, first of all, you meet the coolest people. Look around you, really great people, and you also feel you go to sleep well. You sleep well at night because you're like, well, I did something today. I didn't just sit around wringing my hands. It won't be easy, and there are no guarantees. Freedom is not a guarantee. I mean, I bet every single one of you in this church, think about your ancestors. At some point in the globe, at some point in history, they had to fight for their freedoms, right? But it was worth it, isn't it? If they could do it, we must try. We owe it not just to ourselves, but to future generations. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much.